Hello everybody, Jade Hamilton here again, and today I am celebrating Tamara's hashtag, um, which is So Blue Dolly Sunday. So I am in my favourite blue dress, which has multiple blue stripes, all different shades of blue, and a little bit of white to break it up, and white buttons. But also because So Blue Dolly Sunday now includes um, all the cool colours, so green and various shades thereof, and various shades thereof. I thought I'd introduce you to one of the Christmas cubs I bought myself. Her name is Maria Rebecca, and she is a limited edition Rapunzel Build-A-Bear, who I found on eBay. She cost me, I think, 22 quid, including postage, which for a limited edition I didn't think was too bad. And she's wearing a beautiful dress that one of my carers helped me pick out a little while ago. It's from Next. It's a 0 to 3 month size, and it's white, and it's got green leaves and beautiful violet wildflowers printed on it. It's made of a sort of a cottony material, quite twinkly, and it's got little lace caps around the sleeves, and as I say, it buttons at the back. And she's got her little Rapunzel heelys on that are sort of amethyst purple. And I didn't realise this until just now, that she's got the most gorgeous green eyes. So she's very on theme. And today, we're going to start another story on this channel, because you know how I love the story. And this time it's going to be another of my favourites. This one is for slightly older children. I first encountered it when I was about 12, and it's Buddy by Nigel Hinton, which is now rightly considered a classic. Brilliant book. There's also a really brilliant film of it, or sort of mini-series, starring Roger Daltrey as Buddy's dad, Terry. If you'd like to look it up, you can find it on YouTube. Just type in "screen to Buddy" and you'll probably find it. That's how I came across Buddy actually at first, was through that film, because we were given script to read in English, and we did that round robin thing, you know, where they go round the class and they pick all the parts out. And I played Buddy's mum, Carol, and we just had a really good time with it. It's a really good story. I will say though, I'll do my BBC announcer thing and say that the language in it does reflect the attitudes of the time. And as per all videos where I read, all copyright goes to Nigel Hinton and to his publisher, which in this case is Puffin. I own Penguin. I own absolutely nothing. And also, if you haven't checked Tamara out already, please do. She's a wonderful lady She's full of fun. She wants to try and, she really tries hard to include everybody in the community, including slightly loopy teddy bear collectors like me. And honestly, do go and check her out. Her videos will make your day. She's got some beautiful babies, and she deserves a lot more subs. So do go and check her out if you haven't already. Make yourself comfortable. Grab a hot drink if you've got one, and we'll begin. Chapter 1. Buddy stole the money from his mother's purse just before he left school. His mother was in the kitchen clearing up the breakfast things, and his father was still in bed. He tiptoed into the front room and slipped the purse out of her handbag. He clicked it open and took out a £5 note. A wave of disgust swept through him. Only 2 weeks ago he'd vowed to himself that he was going to stop shoplifting, and here he was stealing from his own mother. He hadn't done that since he was a little kid and had sometimes nicked the odd 10 pence. He was turning into a real thief. There must be something the matter with him. First, the shoplifting. He'd done it a couple of times with some other boys from school. They'd stopped, but he'd gone on doing it alone. And now this. He heard his mum come out of the kitchen, and in a moment of panic he fumbled with the catch on the purse. It wouldn't close properly, so he just chucked it in the bag, still open. He put the handbag back on the sofa, crumpled the note into his pocket, and went out of the room. His mum was in the hall, putting on her coat. "Hurry up, you're late," she said, then called up the stairs, "Terry!" There was no answer from his dad. His mum called out again, then started up the stairs. Buddy put on his shoes, and while he was tying up the laces, he heard angry voices coming from upstairs. Another row. Recently there had been more rows than anything else. He hated to hear his mum and dad shouting like that. "I'm going," he called. There was no reply, so he went out the front door, slamming it behind him. The morning at school was terrible. The money for the class trip didn't have to be handed in until lunchtime, so he knew he could still change his mind. He went through the arguments again and again. He could take the money back. His mum was bound to notice it had gone. Money was precious since the factory had closed and his dad had lost his job. He could always leave it lying on the floor, as if it had fallen out of a bag. He didn't even want to go on the trip. £4 to see some stupid castle and safari park. On the other hand, he didn't want to stay behind again. It would be the third thing he'd missed this term alone. The other times, the visit to the theatre, and the trip to the Three Counties Cultural Show, he'd been the only one not going from 3E. He'd had to join another class for the day, and it had been awful. This time he hadn't even bothered to ask for the money. He knew what his parents would say. "We can't afford it." Well, it was all right for them. They still had the things they wanted. They both smoked. That cost a fortune nowadays, and it was bad for them. And his dad had started going out to the pub in the evenings. His mum moaned about that, saying it was a waste of money and he was mixing with the wrong crowd again, but it didn't stop him doing it. The more Buddy thought about it, the more it seemed he had right on his side. If his mum and dad had to give up smoking and drinking for a couple of days, so much the better, it would be good for them. Still, he hesitated a moment when Mr. Normington said, Right, 3E, hands up for the people who brought the money for the trip to Newton Castle. Buddy looked around and saw everybody's hand go up. Then he raised his hand too. His dad was out when Buddy got home, and his mum wouldn't be back from work for nearly an hour. He went to his room and got on with his homework. He was just finishing some French when the front door banged. Buddy! His heart lurched. His mother's voice sounded sharp and angry. He heard her running up the stairs. Then his door opened. Where is it? She asked. What? Don't play the innocent with me. The £5 you took from my purse this morning. But he denied it a couple of times. He even suggested that perhaps it had been stolen by someone at her office. Then suddenly he couldn't hold out any longer. He admitted he'd done it and started to explain why. He expected her to be furious, but what happened was worse. She began to cry. She leaned against the wall and tears ran down her face. He stood shocked and ashamed for a moment, then moved towards her. He wanted to hold her, to beg forgiveness. I'm sorry, he mumbled, and reached out to touch her, but she pushed him away. He tried again, but this time her temper broke and she shouted, Get away! Leave me alone! You're as bad as him! Like father, like son, that's what you are! But he backed away and sat on the bed. His mum stayed there, crying, for a few minutes. Then she wiped her face and went to the door. She didn't look back, but Buddy heard the one word she said, quietly and full of bitterness. Thief! She went out of the room and closed the door. He lay on the bed and cried. She looked so pale, so hurt. The lines near her mouth, the dark rings around her eyes. He had caused those. Once or twice he tried to defend himself in his own mind, but each time he remembered her face and her tears and the way she said, Thief! Perhaps she knew about the shoplifting. After an hour he got undressed and got into bed. He wasn't hungry and he couldn't bear the idea of going down and facing his mum. Not long after, she came up and opened the door. He closed his eyes tight, pretending to be asleep. She said his name once, but he didn't move. She went away. He lay there for ages, thinking, if only there was some way he could turn back the clock to this morning. If only he'd never taken the money. Like father, like son. He knew what she meant. The big secret, the thing they never talked about. It had happened 4 years ago when Buddy had been 9. For 3 months his dad had disappeared. His mum had just said that he was away somewhere for his work. But Buddy had missed him terribly, and the atmosphere in the house had been tense and gloomy. Then when his dad came back, he'd taken Buddy for a walk and told him the truth, just suddenly in the middle of the park. I've been in prison, he'd said. 3 months for breaking and entering. But it's all over, see? I've done time and that's it. We'll forget it, okay? Then after a long pause, still love me? Buddy had nodded and his dad had given him a hug. And now, his mum thought it was going to happen to him too. Sometime much later, he woke up. There was an argument going on downstairs. It must be about him. His mum must have told his dad, and now they were shouting at each other because of him. He put the pillow over his head and pressed his ears to keep the sound out. The next morning, the house was very quiet. He got dressed and went downstairs. His dad was asleep at the kitchen table with his head resting on his arms. Buddy shook him and he sat up. Where's Mum? Buddy asked, the blood pounding in his ears. Gone. For one terrible moment, Buddy felt as if he were going to laugh. Where? His dad shook his head. For the rest of the day, Buddy was certain she'd be home when he got back from school, but she wasn't. Then he gave it a week. She'd be back within a week. His dad cooked the meals and they ate them in silence. They did everything in silence. Buddy ached to talk about it, to say he was sorry, but he couldn't. The only thing his dad said was not to talk about it to anyone, not at school, nowhere. Buddy promised, and it made him feel more hopeful. His dad must want to keep it quiet because he thought she'd be back soon. The week passed, then another, and another. Gradually, as it turned into months, Buddy gave up hope. She wasn't coming back, and it was all his fault. Chapter 2. Buddy left his house at 8 o'clock. He didn't have enough money for the bus, so he'd have to walk. If he could get to school without stepping on a single crack in the pavement, everything would be okay. Not everything. That'd be too much to ask. What then? He wouldn't get into trouble for wearing jeans. He'd get a good mark on the biology test. And he wouldn't die until he was old. How old? Over 60. Right, but no cheating. All the way and not a single crack. By the time he reached the high street, he was fed up with the effort of watching every step. The jeans and the test didn't matter. But he couldn't give up now because of the other thing. If he broke the bargain, he might die at any time. Today, tomorrow. It happened to people of his age, even younger. There was that girl in junior school. She got some blood thing. She went into hospital and never came out. Then there was that boy in year 8. He'd been knocked off his bike by a lorry. There'd been rumours that his head had been squashed flat. He went on, stepping carefully, trying to plant his feet in the middle of every paving stone. Stupid to set himself mad tasks like this. Perhaps he was mad. Anyway, what was dying? Everybody had to die sometime. But what was it like? Could you just look down and see yourself lying there dead? Brendan Johnson once told him that if you died in your sleep, it was like being asleep forever. But if you died in an accident or somebody murdered you, it was like being murdered or run over forever. As soon as he heard it, Buddy knew that it was the sort of idea that would keep floating in and out of his mind. And it did, nearly every day. All kinds of crazy things came into his brain nowadays. Stupid things, like his name had a curse on it. Buddy Holly, his dad's favourite singer, had died at 22. And now he would die young because he'd been named after him. And stupid games. And stupid games. If he held his breath until a bird flew off a wire, his mum would be home when he got back after school. Then cheating and making a loud noise to scare the bird because he couldn't hold his breath any longer. If people could see a quarter of the weird things in his head, he'd end up in a loony bin like a shot. Like now, people were giving him strange looks because of the way he was having to avoid the lines. They already had their suspicions. Buddy Clark the loony. He even walks differently. As I've said, the language in this book reflects the language and attitudes of the time. We wouldn't call Buddy a loony now. That's a bit of an offensive word, but He is clearly struggling with his mental health a little bit because of what's going on with his parents. Bless him. As if he didn't look different enough already. Blazer, miles too short at the sleeves. Jeans instead of grey trousers. Shirt, not nearly as clean as his mum used to make them. And a stinking white plastic bag to carry his books and things. More than anything, he hated that. Everyone else had smart satchels, or even the latest trend in his class, businessmen's document cases, hard and heavy and very useful for smashing into people's shins on the stairs. Sometimes he wished he'd never been promoted to the E stream, E for Express, the top class. Sorry. Sometimes almost wished he'd never been promoted to the E stream. E for Express, the top stream, the stream that would take exams early. E for exams. He'd been so thrilled at the end of year 7 when his class teacher had told him he was going up because his tests had been excellent. E for excellent. It seemed like the best thing that had ever happened to him. It would have been, except E for except. He wasn't like the others. It wasn't just that they all seemed to be able to buy whatever they wanted. It was the way they talked, the things they talked about, the way they casually used names of newspapers and books, names of places they'd been to, names of things their parents had bought. They weren't cleverer than he was. In fact, some of them weren't as clever, but they were different. It was the difference between hard black document cases and a white plastic bag. It was arriving at school on your bike or in your parents' car, not walking on the street, trying not to step on lines on the pavement. But he took more and more careful steps and turned with relief onto the tarmac of the school drive. He'd done it. His legs ached from the strain, but not once had he touched a line. It didn't do him any good, of course. As soon as he started upstairs to his classroom, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Mr. Normington, 3E's class teacher. "I told you about those yesterday," Mr. Normington said, pointing at his jeans. "You said it was only while your mother was preparing your trousers." "Yes, sir." "Well, she hasn't done them yet." "She hasn't done them yet," Buddy said, taking care with the H of hasn't. "Why not?" For a moment, Buddy wanted to tell him, wanted to shout, "Because I haven't seen her for 5 months, that's why." That would soon shut him up. "I don't know, sir." Mr. Normington sighed. "It's always you, isn't it? Letting down the standards of the rest of the class." Mr. Normington was always talking about standards. He'd been in the school before it had been marked. Mr. Normington was always talking about standards. He'd been in the school before it had been reorganised. Standards had been so much higher then. The express class had to maintain those standards. The express class was the last bastion, not just of academic standards, but of dress and behaviour too. Bastion was one of Mr. Normington's favourite words. He put his hand on the back of Buddy's neck and squeezed, not hard enough to complain about, but hard enough to show that he could hurt him if he wanted to. Upstairs, and no denim tomorrow. Squeeze, squeeze, push, push, up the stairs into the classroom. But he sat down at his desk near the door and noticed that Julius and Charmian weren't in their places behind him. He hoped the twins weren't away. He'd never had black friends before. In fact, he'd said some nasty things to some black kids in his junior school. But he'd been drawn to Julius and Charmian because they were the only other people who didn't fit in with the rest of the class. He'd started off by admiring the cheerful way they ignored all the spiteful jibes that the other pupils, and even some of the teachers, made. They'd become his allies, and then gradually his closest friends. Mr. Normington started calling the register. He looked up when there was no answer from Julius and Charmian. The Ribeiro twins still away? There was a little smirk on his face as he added, I wonder where our ace students can be. Now, the book does go into this in a minute, but the reason Mr. Normington is smirking when he says that is that the word ace could be used as an offensive term for black people. And being very bright, Mr. Normington is very aware of that. He's doing it very deliberately. Obviously, that is not on, and we wouldn't do that now, and we shouldn't have been doing it then, to be fair. He put a heavy emphasis on the word ace, and everyone knew what he meant. Yesterday they'd been learning about similes, and someone had suggested as black as the ace of spades, and he'd said, that's certainly a simile, but I don't think Master and Miss Ribeiro would approve if they were here. People had sniggered then, and they were sniggering now. Buddy had wanted to say something to wipe the silly grins off their faces. Wanted to tell them they were stupid snobs and the twins were better than all of them put together. At the very least, he could have sat there stony-faced as his friends were mocked. But he smiled. Mr. Normington was looking in his direction, and in an attempt to show he belonged in 3E, and that he was on the sides of Mr. Normington's bastions and standards. But he smiled and joined in the general chuckle. He hated himself for wanting to belong to all that, but it was true. He did. A huge part of him wanted it. The rest of the day went badly, and he was almost glad. It was a punishment for betraying his friends. 2 more teachers told him off about his genes, and he got less than half marks in the biology test. So much for the stupid pavement game. He was still going to die young. At afternoon registration, Mr. Normington handed out forms for the parents' consultation evening later that month. Buddy was so busy brooding about the idea of his dad coming to school that he only half listened as Mr. Normington went on about the litter in the classroom. Well, who's responsible? Mr. Normington barked in his landed voice. Buddy looked up, and he just happened to catch the teacher's eyes on him. "It weren't me, sir," he said, and then cursed himself for the mistake. "Wasn't. It wasn't me," Mr. Norrington sneered. "Well, frankly, I don't care. Since you speak and look like a dustman, you can do a dustman's job. Clean it up." There was absolute silence in the room as he went around the desks, picking up the bits of paper. He didn't look at anyone. A couple of people at the back, near the back, slyly put their feet on their bits and pieces, making it harder to pick them up. His hands were dirty when he finished. As he threw the paper into the bin, he vowed that one day he would get his revenge. Chapter 3. When Buddy got home from school, he saw his dad sitting outside the house. He was in his shirt sleeves. He was arguing with a man. The man was raising the tailboard of a truck. His dad's Harley Davidson was on the truck, but he could hear his dad swearing. The man finished locking the tailboard, then walked round and got into the cab. His dad followed and banged on the door. There was a puff of blue smoke from the exhaust of the truck as the engine started. His dad kicked the front tyre. The man inside tooted the horn. His dad stood back and the truck drove away. Buddy hid behind a hedge so that his dad wouldn't see him. When he peeped out a minute later, the street was empty. It didn't look like his house without the Harley Davidson outside. The motorbike was his dad's most important possession. He'd be heartbroken or angry or both. Buddy opened the back door quietly. The kitchen smelled of stale frying, which always clung to his clothes. He'd been aware of it ever since one of the boys in his class had pushed him away, saying, you stink like a fish shop clerk." After that, he told his dad that he didn't want a fried breakfast any more. His dad had seemed almost hurt. "You need something hot in you," he'd said. "Nothing like it. Egg and fried slice first thing." Fried slice, by the way, is fried bread. So you fry up the bacon. It's usually bacon in a frying pan, and then you put a piece of bread in the bacon fat and let it fry until it goes crisp. And that's what your fried slice of bread. But Buddy had insisted he'd rather have cereals. Since then he'd had breakfast alone in the front room. His dad stayed in bed now, as if cooking Buddy's breakfast had been the only reason for getting up. He went along the hall and opened the door of the front room. His dad was slumped on the sofa, his eyes closed. He kicked his shoes off, and there was a big hole in one of his bright green socks. When Buddy had been a little kid, he'd got lost in a big shop. He'd sat on the floor and cried until he saw his dad coming. On the floor, in the middle of all those legs, he'd known it was his dad because of the socks. Nobody else wore green or pink fluorescent socks. "Dad?" he said. There was no answer. He walked over to the window and looked out. There was a patch of oil on the little bit of concrete outside. His dad had put the concrete down so that the bike would have somewhere to stand. He'd taken down the fence and laid the concrete over the tiny strip of grass that had been the garden. The council had sent a man round to complain, but his dad had just laughed. But he had to admit it looked a bit ugly, especially now the bike had gone. Perhaps the grass would grow through the concrete. There was a loud sigh, and the plastic material on the sofa squeaked as his dad moved. In the old days, when things had been fun, his dad used to make them all laugh about the rude noises the sofa made when he moved on it. There was a long silence, and Buddy could almost feel the pressure of it in his ears. Then suddenly his dad spoke. "Pigs! They've took me Harley. Taken my Harley." Buddy clenched his teeth to stop himself correcting his dad. This happened all the time now. He was so used to being corrected at school that it was almost a habit. His dad had threatened to knock his block off if he kept doing it, but that wasn't why he tried to stop. It was that look in his dad's eyes, a look that said, "Are you ashamed of me?" And the awful truth was that he was, sometimes, and his dad knew it. "I nearly done the bloke over. Told him I'd get the money. Only owe a couple of months. It's always money." There was a thump as his dad hit something. Buddy knew he shouldn't have come in here. Not with his dad in a mood like this. He knew what was coming next. He wanted to get out, but couldn't move. He felt too awkward. "Suppose you need some tomorrow and all." Buddy dug his fingernails into his palms. It wasn't fair. He couldn't help it if he needed money sometimes. Why does his dad always start on about it? "Here, you! I'm talking to you." "Nothing." "What?" "I said nothing. I don't want any money." "Blimey, that makes a change. Supposed to be free schools." "Don't make me laugh. If they was free, I'd still have me Harley." Suddenly, all the fence Suddenly, all the events of the day crashed in on him, and he turned round, boiling with anger. "I haven't even got proper trousers. My others are all worn out." "They wouldn't be if you took proper care of them," his dad snapped back. "I did take proper care of them. They're worn out. And they're too small. I've grown. What do you expect me to do? Stop growing?" "Don't you get cheeky with me. You're asking for trouble, you are." "Yeah? Well, I have to wear jeans and I get into trouble for that. Tough luck. And it's tough luck about your Harley. It's not my fault if you had a flipping job." Buddy stopped. "Sorry, slight technical hitch, guys. I apologise." I'm going to pause you for a second while I deal with technical difficulties. Oh, hang on. Anyway, where were we? "And it's tough luck about your Harley. It's not my fault if you had a flipping job." Buddy stopped. He was trembling. Tears of rage had filled his eyes. He blinked and they rolled down his face. His dad stood up for a moment. Buddy thought he was going to come across and hit him. Instead, he just glared, then turned away. Buddy grabbed his plastic bag and ran out of the room, slamming the door. He thought of slamming the front door too, but he couldn't think where to go. He tiptoed quietly up to his bedroom. He lay down on his bed. He shouldn't have said that about the job. All right, but what about the things his dad had said? He didn't take care of his trousers. They were 2 years old. They were too tight and too short. There were holes in the inside legs because they were worn thin. Like his dad's socks. They had holes in them. He wished he'd said that. He never thought of clever things to say until it was too late. He still shouldn't have said that about the job. He should have stayed calm and not got into an argument about the job. And not got into an argument about that. Whatever else he was, his dad wasn't lazy. He tried and tried for jobs since the factory had closed. Buddy knew that. Jobs were hard to find. It was cold in the bedroom, but he didn't move. Didn't even bother to get into his sleeping bag. Shadows filled the room as it got darker. He lay and gazed out the window. The house next door blocked most of the view, but he could see a triangle of dark blue night sky. There was one bright star in the triangle. He closed his eyes and wished. When his dad called upstairs and asked if he'd like something to drink, half of him wanted to say yes. He wanted the argument to be over, to be able to go and sit down and drink a cup of tea with his dad. The other half of him wanted something more, wanted to stay up here in the cold alone. It wanted to hurt his dad, make him pay for the things he said, make him miserable. Buddy! Buddy, do you want some tea? His dad called again. No, he shouted, trying to make his voice sound sad. Cutting off your nose to spite your face. That's what his mum always used to say about moods like that. Well then, he just cut off his nose. 10 minutes later, there was the sound of music from down below. It was loud, one of his dad's records. He strained to hear which one it was. All those old 45s and the precious 78s that he wouldn't let anyone touch. They were much more than music to his dad. They were memories, dreams, hopes, and sometimes there were messages. Buddy knew all the voices, all the names. He'd learned the songs like nursery rhymes when he was a kid. This one was a woman, Brenda Lee. Little Miss Dynamite, his dad always called her. This song was I'm Sorry. The record ended, and a minute later, Buddy heard his dad leave the house. Chapter 4. Buddy didn't get warm all evening. He'd become really cold when he'd been lying on the bed, but he didn't allow himself to put his fan heater on. It was too expensive. He made himself a piece of toast and a cup of coffee, and then went back to his room and lay on the floor to do his homework. By the time he'd finished writing, his whole front was almost numb from the cold lino. Lino, by the way, for those who aren't aware, is linoleum. It's the stuff you put on flooring, sort of almost like sort of rubbery, plasticky stuff, but not quite. He sat on the bed and wrapped his sleeping bag round himself while he read a book and made notes for his history special study. The teacher had made them each choose one famous person to find out about and give a short speech on to the rest of the class. It was Buddy's turn tomorrow. He'd chosen Richard the Lionheart because he'd seen a good film about him. The film had made him seem like a great hero, but the more Buddy read, the less he liked him. He seemed to spend most of his life killing people because they weren't Christians. Some hero. His death was horrible, though. He got hit in the neck by an arrow. Someone cut the arrow out, but the wound went rotten and he developed gangrene. Buddy didn't want to read about it, but he couldn't stop. Richard took days to die, and he knew he was dying, and kept talking about it. What had he felt, though? Had he been scared? He'd been 42 when he died, only 2 years older than Buddy's dad. He closed the book and looked at his watch. 10:30. Where was his dad? He'd been out nearly 4 hours. He felt a surge of panic, supposing something had happened, an accident. He tried to take his mind off the thought by getting himself ready for bed. He straightened the sleeping bag, no sleep sheets and blankets since his mum had left, and went to the bathroom. He washed his hands and face and looked at himself in the mirror. He was pale, and the dark hair above his lips seemed darker than ever. His mum said he'd always had a moustache, even as a baby. He ran his hand over his cropped hair. He liked the way it felt, spiky but soft. His dad hated it, though, and said he looked like a convict. 10:40. Where was he? Terrible thoughts flew through his head. Hospitals, ambulances, nurses drawing curtains, a doctor coming out and speaking quietly to him. I'm sorry to have to tell you this. Would they make him identify the body? The front door slammed, and he dropped his toothbrush in shock. Buddy? Dad! He rushed down the stairs, his face breaking into a grin of relief. The house suddenly seemed warmer and lighter. Get some plates, his dad said, holding up a brown paper bag. What? Plates, cloth is, and knives and forks. I've got some Chinese for us. Buddy got everything and went into the front room. Music was playing, and the little cartons of Chinese food were open all over the floor. His dad served the food, making corny jokes about fried lice and sweet and sour eyeballs. As soon as he'd started eating, Buddy realised how hungry he'd been, how miserable, worried too, how everything was different. His dad was singing along to the music between mouthfuls, and the row of the afternoon was forgotten. Met an old mate of mine tonight. His dad finished eating and rolled himself a cigarette. Might do a bit of work for him. Honest? That's great. What is it? Oh, this and that. See how it turns out. It's work, all right. It ain't even certain yet. There was a snappy edge to his voice that stopped Buddy asking any more questions. He washed the plates, made a cup of tea for his dad, and then went up to bed. He felt warm and sleepy after the food, and he was already dozing off when he heard the door open. You asleep? You asleep? Nearly. Not yet. Buddy sat up. His dad was standing in the doorway. His face was in shadow. There was a long silence. Then his dad said, We do all right, don't we? You and me? Course we do. Yeah, well. He took a couple of steps into the room and then turned as if he was about to go out again. I'm glad about the job, he wanted his dad to say. I got all worried tonight. What about? I don't know, stupid things. I thought something might have happened. Accident or something. Won't get rid of me that easy, his dad said and laughed. There was another silence and Buddy longed to go on talking about it. He counted to 3 and forced himself to say it. Do you ever think about it? Dying and all that? Yeah, sometimes. Happens, doesn't it? What do you reckon it's like? His voice cracked with the embarrassment of saying it out loud. Dunno, can't be worse than this though, can it? His dad wasn't trying to help at all, but now he'd started. Buddy was determined to go on. I keep thinking about it. I didn't used to. That was true. He never used to worry about it before. It had happened just after his mum left. His dad had spent ages listening to a record called Endless Sleep about a girl who drowned in the sea. He'd suddenly got frightened about his dad dying. It hadn't stopped there. For the first time ever, he realised that one day he, Buddy Clark, was going to die. He'd said it and thought about it before, of course, but he never really believed it. This time he'd known it was true, and it had been like falling off a cliff, except he never got to the ground and he was still falling. It was the sort of thing he could have talked about with his mum. She'd have listened and told him she understood, and then told him she understood, and not to worry. It was only a phase she was going through. That was what she always said about things that worried him. It's only a phase, but it was. But she wasn't there now, and he needed his dad to say it. You've been watching too many horror films on the telly, his dad laughed. Here, I had a story tonight that'll give you the shivers about this house in Croxley Street. What? Croxley Street? Here? In town? But he didn't want to hear any stories that would give him the shivers, but he wanted his dad to stay. Yeah, number 56. It's supposed to be haunted. Some geezer cut his wife's throat with a knife about 25 years ago and then strung himself up. They reckon her ghost walks around the rooms all covered with blood. Now nobody wants to live there. Don't blame them, Buddy said. Well, some people would believe anything. Don't you believe in ghosts? Once you're dead, you're dead. But he couldn't think of anything to say. He wished he'd never started in the first place. He just hoped he wouldn't dream about 56 Croxley Street. Oh well, better turn in, his dad said. Buddy wanted to tell him to leave the door open, but he knew what a joke his dad would make of that. The door closed, and the room was in darkness. He wriggled down as far as he could into his sleeping bag and tried to think of other things. What would Mr. Normington say if he turned up in jeans again? Would he be able to do his speech okay? He tried to remember the main points of what he was going to say, but he kept imagining the arrow in Richard's neck. Stop it! He made himself think of his mum. He tried to picture her face. It was difficult. He could only capture glimpses of it. Surely he couldn't have forgotten what she looked like already. At last, he caught a full picture of her in his mind. Holding it there, he fell asleep. We'll leave it there. I apologise for all the spooky bits. I haven't read this in a long time. So if you wish, I'm sorry, I would have put it in a separate video if I'd known. But thank you all so much for watching, subscribing, commenting. It really makes my day when you do. And Maria and I will see you soon. Can you wave, Maria? Good girl. Thanks so much, everybody. Cheerio!